Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the discussion of Ukrainian Contemporary Art Triennale Ukraine cross-section with the theme Ukraine Unmuted this year. I will tell a few words in Lithuanian as well for audience here, and then we will turn to English for the rest of the time. Labas vakaras visiems, kurie esate čia Vytauto Didžiojo universiteto Leonido Donskio bibliotekoje ir visiems tiems, kas žiūrite mus internetu, transliaciją. Tai šį vakarą turime dar vieną diskusiją, kuri yra Ukrainos šiuolaikinio meno trienalės Ukrainian Cross-Section 6 metų tema Ukraine Unmuted. Ši diskusija yra trienalės lydinčiosios programos renginių dalis ir dėkojame susirinkusiems diskusijos dalyviams, moderatoriai. Ačiū Vytauto Didžiojo universitetui už priėmimą ir įsileidimą mus į savo erdves šiam renginiui. Tad toliau iš tiesų perduosiu žodį moderatoriai ir diskusijos dalyviams. So I will say again a short introduction in English as well. We thank for Vytautas Magnus University for letting us have this event here at Vytautas Magnus University, Leonidas Donskis Library. And we will continue the discussion moderated by Oksana Forostina.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you this great institution for hosting us. I'm here on behalf of the Institute of Cultural Strategy in Lviv and the 5th triennial of Contemporary Ukrainian Art Ukrainian cross-section. I hope those of us who haven't been to the exhibition will have it a chance soon. That's a post office here in Kaunas, Ukraine Unmuted. Very welcome. And at the very beginning, my special thanks to Renaissance Foundation in Ukraine for helping us to organize this discussion. That's the third one. We already had two weeks ago. And the whole idea behind this discussion was to have one speaker from Ukraine and one from outside of Ukraine, from other countries. And this time it's a bit different because we have Kate Younger. She came from Vienna and she is American Viennese historian, permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and she's also a head of Ukrainian program in the Institute for many years already. And Professor Gintautas Mažeikis is partly our host today also, because that's your institution, and he's a public and intellectual here in Lithuania. Actually, our first Lithuania speaker. Thank you very much. I think we missed this Lithuanian context in our first discussions, so very much thank you for joining us. And today we will talk a bit about history, but not as a long history, ancient history, but very recent one. And one of curators of our Ukrainian cross-section many years ago said me that maybe all those underground artists had a huge challenge when they got freedom at the end of 80s, at the beginning of 90s, because the thing about being an artist, a writer, an intellectual in the authoritarian, despotic regime is that you also have this significant other. I mean, the regime, the oppression, and when you're finally free, the whole context is changing, and it's also a big challenge for the works how relevant are the works of the artists from the 80s, from the 70s? How relevant is their intellectual legacy after they got freedom? And we had this conversation maybe 20 years ago, and we had a feeling that we're closing it now. But now everything is changing again. And I got this idea, maybe we should look back and think about it again. And maybe Kate, you will start. And I will address the same question to you.
No, Oksana, thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this discussion and for posing this question, which is one that really gets at something that I've been thinking about a lot since February, which is what happens when we are confronted with something that could be seen as morally unambiguous, right? When we look at the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in some ways it recalls the sort of moral unambiguity that artists, dissident thinkers, those during the Cold War behind the Iron Curtain felt towards the regime. But you know who else also in some ways lost this sort of moral unambiguity, and this is the context I'm coming from here, is the West, right? There was this sense in which it was easy to portray we are standing up against the evil empire. So that was a very comfortable position to take. But now, then after the end of the Cold War, right, and this is something that we have been kind of conditioned to lump into one category, the end of the Soviet Union, the triumph of capitalism, the end of history, right, all of these things we kind of bring together. That then raises up a new generation of public intellectuals in the West who are very much resistant to the idea of calling something black and white. And so now we're witnessing the knock-on consequences of that when something that is so morally unambiguous returns to the stage, right? We see within Western discourse a complete rejection of the idea that we could condemn Russian aggression full scale, because this then gets at our own sense of not having worked through our past, of all of those sorts of things. And so I think you're really right, and I'm looking forward to being able to talk more about what these legacies actually are.
At the beginning, I would like to remember one American, probably, and Britain philosopher Samuel Huntington, who wrote his famous book, The Clash of Civilization, which was very criticized after publishing that it was too much imaginary about the clash of civilization. Everybody criticized him. Look, the world is very peaceful and nobody would like to fight against each other, and you just dream about you elaborate it, you created your concept. This is artificial, not the real, and Muslims could survive together with Christians, you know, and the big centers of civilizations could be together, you know, and everything could be nice. It's interesting that I didn't pay attention about this book too much, but when I would say that after 24th of February, I reread this book again. Why? Because I remembered that Samuel Huntington wrote that this war between Ukraine and Russia should happen because civilizational, you know, differences, and he just maintain about possibility of this war in 1996, and and the reason was analysis of Yugoslavian war, and he showed that look, if the differences between Serbs and Croats. It's so big, you know, and the war started between Serbs and Croats in 1992. The war started of Yugoslavia. And look, these differences are completely the same like in Ukraine and Russia. 100%. And they said, look, at the border of interest, and he just draw the border of interest between Serbs and Croats, and he said, okay, look, this war should start somewhere about Donbass and Kherson, you know, and about Kharkiv. This is the territory of the clash of interest. And Huntington said that I wonder that this war didn't start still. This period, and everybody criticized. But for me, it was more interesting to discuss actually virtually, imaginary with Huntington on the history, how he explained this is differences. I would say it's some way he is in some way we could accept him, in some way reject him. Okay, the other author who discussed completely the same, like Huntington, but in harsh style, it was Alexander Dugin. Dugin, a very famous national fascist Putinist in Moscow. But he said a little bit differently. He said, look, we need to start this war because civilizational differences. This is similar to Huntington, but not because of Ukraine. But these differences exist between, and I quote Dugin, between Lithuanian, Polish, Ukrainian differences. So we need to stop this anti-Russia that Putin later took this concept from Dugin, probably anti-Russia. Maybe Dugin took this concept from Ivan Ilyin, but I don't know. I'm not sure about it. In a way, Dugin many times claimed that anti-Russia, and what does mean anti-Russia? Anti-Russia, according to him, this is, if you would like, the Republic of two nations, Lithuanian and Poland. Lithuanian in the sense of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, not in this contemporary sense. It means that it could include Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, and maybe Latvia as well. This is under question. Estonia not, because it's Nordic. You see, and there we could interpret as well different historical events, writers, poets, who could be included in this territory, which later was called by Marshal Pilsudski or Josip Pilsudski as intermarium. And my question, what is the culture and I would say, what is the culture and cultural exchange in this territory, which creates special political identity, poetry which creates special political identity, which is so different from Russia that Russian nationalists could call us anti-Russia.
Okay, I have a very quick question for you. Did you have this concept? Of course, that's not yours. But did you think about this concept lately, or was it discussed in the 90s after the Lithuanian independence and after Lithuanian society became much freer than in Soviet times?
No, in Lithuania, this concept was never discussed too much because Lithuanian trauma, I would say trauma, of Lithuanian-Polish relationships between two world wars, between 1918 and 1914. I would say that because Lithuania considered, ethnic Lithuania considered so-called Vilno Republic, Litva Shetkova, Vilna Republic, Central Lithuania. Very short such kind of republic existed like for 2 or 3 years before inclusion into Poland. And later, in a way, Lithuanians very critically accepted Pilsudski idea as some sort of an attempt to occupy or to be Lithuania, to provide hegemonic Polish culture in Lithuania, and therefore they said that we need to reject this Polish invasion. And I would say, if we will read Ukrainian text of pre-war, you know, some related, some let me metonymia, Banderovцы literature, you know, that we could find completely the same reaction on Poland literature, that to these countries, I would say probably, and Western Belarus, in some one way, rejected Polish culture because of they considered it as hegemonic, mainstreaming, you know, or aggressive, colonizing. And this is why they rejected. But the result was terrible, because all these territories split it, you know, they didn't support each other in the dangers of Soviet occupation, in front of Soviet occupation. They didn't support each other. And I just remember that last trip of the last, that partisan of so-called Union UNSO or Banderovцы, who imagined that they need to escape from Ukraine to Lithuania, you know, at the beginning of 50s, you know, that they imagined that there's some kind of partisan movement still exists in Lithuania. This was a fairy tale of them, you know, but in any way it shows that such kind of collaboration could be created. And Solzhenitsyn, in his Archipelago Gulag, wrote that after Second World War, Banderovцы, Lithuanian Green Brothers and the others, they meet each other, but not in the forest, unfortunately, but in Gulag. You know, this was the end of the split between Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Now I found that not in Lithuania rather, but in Ukraine, I found that some of Ukrainians started to speak, and especially Belarusians, started to speak again about intermarium, but not about some kind of one state under Polish ruling, but some alliance, you know, some political alliance, or which could be even opposed EU, European Union, in some one way, or even to any countries, in order to resist Russian aggression, you know, and they was reinterpreted. So I finished my answer. In Lithuania this was a trauma for a long time in Lithuania, but now I found that this could be rediscussed again in Lithuania, but in different way. There are some historians who say, look, we wrongly explain Pilsudski in Lithuania. We do mistakes in our interpretations, political interpretations of Pilsudski, because you remember that Pilsudski originally is Lithuania.
Okay. And it's a very interesting case about how actually this generational thing works. And now I'm coming to you with another generational question. You were recently involved in preparing the English translation of the works of Ukrainian dissident Myroslav Marynovych, who is actually from the 60s. And as we have a broad audience here, also online from different countries, I will make a short remark that Myroslav Marynovych, who is a long-time political dissident, in my opinion, one of the few Ukrainian dissidents, one of the few Ukrainian intellectuals of that generation who are still relevant. And do you have any idea why? what the secret behind that?
So my experience in working with Marynovych's memoir was a kind of very interesting one, because at the same time, so basically one of the reasons that we wanted to bring this out is because we said the story of the dissident movement in the Soviet Union, of the human rights movement, needs to be moved out of exclusively being told from the Moscow perspective, right? Because I think that really dominates in Western academia, right? We're going to talk about Solzhenitsyn, we're going to talk about Sakharov, and then we're going to be done. But instead, we have a much richer tradition that, in fact, goes back to the encounter of the other peoples of the Soviet Union in the Gulag, in human rights organizations. And so with Marynovych, what I saw was that the universality of the way that he is able to talk about what it means to be committed to the right to pursue a normal life. So what Marynovych talked about most in his memoirs, for example, is wanting to be able to go around and speak the language that he wanted. He wanted to speak Ukrainian. He wanted to hang out with his friends. He wanted to be able to drink beer. He wanted to be able to wear a blue or a yellow shirt if he wanted, right? And insisting on those things, those very basic, normal things, he said, this is a human right. He's not talking, of course he can talk in the grand terms of the sort of dignity of individual human life, of the importance of basic fundamental freedoms, all of that, but it's also just about normalcy. And I think this really resonates because it demonstrates, and I think we think about this very much today as well, right? People have the right to live without their electricity and heating being cut off by shelling of their cities, right? These are things that are not specific to a Cold War context or to the Soviet Union context, but rather go beyond. But one of the things that I found very telling when we tried to bring out this translation was that Marynovych speaks in very black and white terms about his feelings about the unworked through communist past, the Soviet past, the legacy of that, which is echoing on today, which he identifies very clearly with Putin. And this was something that that made the editors very nervous, the press that we were working with. They said, how can you talk in such black and white language about Putin as the embodiment of evil, as the failure to work through the sins of communism, as something that will continue to haunt the world? I think the reaction would be quite different today if you brought this same text to those editors, right? I think the full-scale invasion has woken us up to the reality of a lot of those.
Could you give us some Lithuanian context of the same period, of the same generation? Do you think there are still Lithuanian intellectuals of dissidents of the 60s or maybe later who are still relevant, and why? And did you have this discussion maybe in 90s, maybe later? So did you call them? So what was this? Did you have this generational clash?
Yes. Of course. Of course, that's some, I would say, cultural clash existed, not, I would say, not so much political, because why this political clash doesn't happen? Because, you know, some people who burn in independent Lithuania, they was quite old, and they supported Sąjūdis, or this independent movement, and the young generation supported. So grandfathers and grandchildren, that their opinions coincide in this 1990-1991, and this is because friendship between grandmothers, fathers, and grandsons and daughters, you know, that coincide. That we didn't see such clash or conflict of generations. But many of people didn't pay attention on the fathers and mothers, you know, who grew up in a Soviet environment. and this was, I would say, some silent, big silent group, which was later divided into those who supported some nostalgia, Soviet nostalgia, and those who would like to develop this, I would say, liberal economy and different things. Then this is about this conflict of generation. Actually, there was as well between these fathers and mothers, there was a group of so-called underground. Some of these fathers and mothers were very Sovietical, and the others was former hippie, beatniks, and hipsters, what was quite popular in Lithuania. This is generation of Kalanta, of Lithuanian, which tried to do the Prague Revolution, but in 1972 in Kaunas. So there as well we see this split in the one generation. So the question of generations, there was not a big problem. I would say it was a rather problem how to escape from how to break this trauma of Central Eastern Europe, I would say. This is more bigger problem because all these generations negated good relationships with Poland and don't understand exactly why they need to collaborate with Ukraine or Belarus. And they imagined rather relations with Great Britain, United States, and so on. This is very cosmopolitan turn, but not a regional turn. This separation between or conflict between regional turn and this global or cosmopolitan turn, this I would say it's a more important question. It's interesting that for former communists it was easy to turn to global world than to the regional, this because, okay, communism looks like global, and former communists, okay, we could accept this global economy, global market, global circulation of capital, but not about thinking in regional concepts. And only a few of, I would say, activists started to think. What was interesting for me that American Lithuanians from Santara Šviesa, this is movement, they started to agitate in Lithuania. Look, the most similar to us is cultura of Jerzy Giedroyc and this cultural movement. And look, all this Gombrowicz, Giedroyc, actually the Czesław Milosz and all this movement are more similar to Lithuanian movement than all these American Hollywood dreams, Look at this group, and one of the I would say that there was few intellectuals, Aleksandras Štromas, Vytautas Kavolis, late Leonidas Donskis, who supported this turn, and Donskis invited as well Zygmunt Bauman, who participated and who taught not so much, but he taught in Vytautas Magnus University as well. At least I listened to his lectures, and I would say this was as well some important new beginning. But we didn't invite to Lithuania Ukrainian professors, no poets, no writers. And only in this year after war, we started to do it. Like, for example, we invited the band Sabaka and the writer, Sergei Zhadan and Andrukovich, and that many of poets as well, and this is I would say, and some actually producers to Lithuania started to work directly with them. I would say this is, on my opinion, this breakthrough is the most important what could happen. Thank you, Putin, for the opening of Ukraine.
Do you mind if I jump in there? Because I think I think it's really interesting that you bring Giedroyc up here, because I think this is getting at this question that we're kind of circling around of why is Poland now different, right? And I think why. So basically, if we're looking at this region, at these sort of shared historical experiences of Lithuania, Western Belarus, Ukraine, right? We kind of see the two sides of that triangle. Right? So we see Poland on the one side and we see Russia on the other. And I think here Giedroyc has we owe a lot to him that in the post-war period, it was able to be said Poland will respect the borders, right? So the borders of these, there will be an independent Belarus, there will be an independent Ukraine, there will be an independent Lithuania, right? So saying firmly, this is going to be our policy and we are going to sit here in Paris and we're going to work to make that happen. And I think this is a working through of some of these historical inequities and the power that is imposed from one people on another that then opens up possibilities for the future. And I think you're right that there's only now that we're kind of beginning to reckon with what that means and the potential that it opens up. And I think that that's a really wonderful thing. But it also kind of reminds us of all of the other power hierarchies that still wait to be worked through and to be thought through. And this is where I mention an anecdote that I saw recently, a new series that has been started by the University of Amsterdam, I think it is. So they've started a new series of lectures, online events, whatever, that they're calling East-splainers. So we're now all familiar with West-splaining, right? This is something that has entered our vocabulary now. Yes, the West thinks that it can tell the East what they can do. So, okay, so we're gonna have East-splainers. That's a great thing to sort of reimagine. So I start looking at who they're inviting. Russian name, Russian name, Russian name, right? And so we still have this hierarchy that even when the West thinks, okay, let's bring the East in, who do they look to? It's over the heads of the people who can actually tell this story the most interestingly. And so we still have a lot of work to do on that front.
I would like to step back and mention the thing you were talking about before that, about this turn to so-called global cultures, big cultures like American and British. Don't you think that behind that sentiment there is a sort of fatigue of being underground, of being oppressed? So that was a kind of declaration of normality, a declaration of freedom. Maybe you remember actually how it was back then.
I would say that this, a complex of victimization. This complex characterized Central Eastern Europe after collapse of Soviet Union, when many of countries, Slovaks, Czechs, Croats, Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, tried to present themselves as the victims of, colonial Russian regime, and it means, and to present themselves as a former oppressed nations that couldn't create nothing important for the world, and which could not compete with Russian culture. And it was, I would say, it's some self-humiliation through victimization, which doesn't help to be equal participant of a cultural dialogue, in the Western countries and the world. And it was the real problem. And we didn't try to create our own, I would say, cultural capital circulation in our region. It means that one time, a few of my friends from Croatia came to Lithuania and first time saw Čiurlionis exhibition, and they said, wow, they said, look how it's good, looks why we didn't know about him nothing, in Croatia. And one of them, my good friend, explained, look, because the domination of British and French museums in our memory and our, they completely colonized these museums, and their editions completely colonized our memory and art acceptance. And we don't know, no Chirlonis, no other painters, if they are not the part of cultural capital of these museums, So in order to participate in the memory, in order to build common heritage, we need to create some kind of a regional cultural capital circulation. It means to edit our own poets, writers, to read them, to comment them, painters, sculptures, to organize exhibitions, to participate, to know each other, and if you would like, to stop in some one way reading of world literature, because if you have actually a lot of time, you could do everything. But if you have only a couple hours per day, and you need what to read. This is very important, to invite regional poets and writers. But why do you need? Because it depends from your needs and supply. And I would say that only if we will organize common exhibitions, or some conferences or forums and you will be invited to read something. Because, for example, that I found Sergei Zhadan, his novel Voroshilovograd, and tried even to read in Ukrainian language. It was absolutely terrible for me for the first 2 days. I would say later it became more or less normal. The book is wonderful, unbelievable, very good, I would say. But why I did it? Because I have many friends in Ukraine, and I would like not only to speak about, that some American writers, but as well to be friendly to them, to show that I knew your painters, writers, because we're talking together, not to be, alienated. This is, but as well, you see, this is a problem because it is the only beginning, liberation, not from Russia culture as well, but as well from Western monopolization of culture through acknowledging each other in this region.
I think that's so important, and I think it's a wonderful project, and that we should put whatever resources and efforts we can into making that happen. And I think the other thing that we can do is, and this is not something that should have to be on the backs of people who come from this region, but it does fall there, is to bring these new ideas and new topics into the world conversation as well, right? And so this is one of the things that we at the Institute are trying to do in our Ukrainian program, is kind of highlight things where Ukrainian cultural figures, academics have insights that actually are going to matter a lot for the world as a whole. And I think of two particular examples. So I have a colleague, Katherine Younger, who is a publisher and a writer. And she wrote this spring of something that she noticed as Ukrainians are caring for each other during the war, right? So as it falls on them to kind of reach out and look after the more vulnerable in society. And she says, what if this becomes something that we actually reconstruct societies on more broadly, a basis of solidarity and care for each other that is rooted in a 20th century Eastern European dissident intellectual tradition, right? But what if now the Ukrainian experience of the past 9 months and the past 8 and plus years is the basis for that? And I think also of a young colleague, of a young historian, anthropologist, Daria Cymbaluk, who works on the people's relationship with the environment around them, plants, animals, the landscape, right? And this is something that the Ukrainian experience and how that landscape is being destroyed right now can actually help us all think more about the Anthropocene, right? And the place that humans are playing within the world around them. And so bringing these new themes into bigger discussions, I think, is another way to highlight these important intellectual traditions that are happening.
Kid, I would like to make a kind of homage to the institute, and full disclosure, not foreign for me too, because I'm a fellow there, but I'm non-residential fellow, and Kate is permanent. So that's a great institution in Vienna. Established in the 80s, partly with a mission to be a meeting point for intellectuals and academics from Eastern Europe, from so-called socialist countries with their Western colleagues. And Krzysztof Michalski, Polish philosopher, was behind this idea. And when you are there these days, you can see the photos on the walls, these black and white photos from the conference from 1990, if I'm not mistaken, with all these great guys of the era, like Krzysztof Michalski, Józef Tischner, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Soros, by the way, yes, at this big conference organized by the Institute. And for me, that's still an inspiration. But at the same time, I remember a moment, kind of fatigue of this era. And now, after invasion, we Ukraine, and I guess in a broader sense, the whole part of the world, also Lithuania, also Estonia, all our countries, we have our moment at some point. You know, we have attention, and I already think about how to avoid this kind of fatigue in future. What do you think?
This is one of the most difficult tasks ahead of us, right? But I think a little bit of what I was saying just now is one of the ways that I'm thinking about avoiding it, right? Is by constantly bringing, and this is a lot of work, but by constantly bringing new approaches and new ways of thinking to the table, of making sure that we're not kind of having the same conversations over and over. And I think there is a richness of thought coming from this region that can be drawn on to make sure that that continues to happen. The other thing I would say is that fatigue goes both ways. One of the things, so when I was putting together this photo exhibition, we were reading over the conference transcripts from the time. And basically this was a conference at which thinkers from this region came together very much with representatives of big Western institutions. Jeff Sachs was there, people like this, right? And already there you could see that the Polish intellectuals, the Hungarian intellectuals realized that these Westerners had no clue, right? They did not understand what was happening here. They did not understand the depth of the political conflicts within, for example, the Polish delegation that was there. And yet they were going to have the power to make a lot of decisions about what happened. And so I think it's fair to experience that fatigue in both ways, to recognize it and then to fight through it and to not succumb to it, basically.
I have a question, a special Lithuanian question for you, and special admiration for you as a representative of Lithuania, because before the invasion, you know, after all of that, many people forgot about, but Lithuania demonstrated a very strong message on Taiwan. That was a small country who actually stand for Taiwan, being not afraid of mighty China and Germany, who is of course interested in, you know, making everything peaceful and silent and all the issue. So, do you have a kind of solution how to make Lithuanian voices more powerful, not only now in the situation when they again we have an admiration also for supporting of Ukraine, and I think that people in Taiwan also admire you for standing for them, but how to keep it how to keep it constant, more or less.
You know, that's I would like a bit return back in order to answer this question. That when Lithuania became independent in 1918, you know, after First World War, Lithuanians didn't know exactly who could be ambassadors or cultural attaches in different countries, because we do not have good representative, and we invited many of poets and writers to be just our representatives, you know, and between them was Oscar Miloš, that's a French poet who hated to be called a Polish poet. And he had anti-Polish, I don't know why, this is long story, about his mother Jewish, and this Polish attitude to Jewish, his mother Jewish, that in a way he decided to be Lithuanian, even that he never been in Lithuania, and to represent Lithuania, he took that citizenship of Lithuania and started to represent Lithuania in French in the beginning of 20s. It was a very difficult period because French state decided to support the only Great Poland and they considered that Lithuania is some obstacle for the recognition of Great Poland, and so the French tried to stop Lithuanian independence in the beginning of 20s in order to support, as I said, Great Poland vision, which could resist Bolshevik Russian. So in this one situation, this Oscar Miloš started to discuss, but he was very involved into all French circles, and he decided to write one article where he said, what is the difference between Polish and Lithuanian messianism? It was, I would say, it's very interesting because 90 and 99% of Lithuanians don't know that they have messianism. Only 1,001% could think about this question, but you know, in a way he presented it. It was very interesting idea. He learned from the Lithuanian rebellions that probably, if we'll check that some in our contemporary concepts, discourse analysis of Lithuanian rebellions, he would say that Lithuanian messianism is some kind revelation of nations, revelation of to support all revelation of nations, you know. And then when 1990 started, you know, Lithuania, Lithuanians took very old slogan, за наши ваша вольность, or in Russian, за нашу вашу свободу, for our and yours freedom. This one slogan, which coincide with Oscar Miloš concept of Lithuanian messianism to support independence of countries, you know, who fights for freedom and independence. From this point of view, this is very exactly clear why Lithuanians support Taiwan. Even if nobody in the world, no one country don't support Taiwan, Lithuanians have to support if they follow this messianistic idea, you know, and to fight even if there is no even any reason to fight for the independence of Taiwan. This is very strange for Chinese, who thinks completely in different paradigm, and Russia, who thinks in different paradigm, and even Poland, who thinks in different paradigm. You know, that because all these countries have different messianistic ideas. Unfortunately, the other 99% of Lithuanians don't know about this.
I think that's really interesting and points to another thing that I've been thinking about, not about messianism, though this is very interesting, but about this sort of possibility of global connections, right, that go beyond these sort of regional ones or whatever. And here, I think, going back to Zhadan, who's been frequently invoked here today, very recently, the New York Review of Books and several other publications published an exchange of letters between Zhadan and the Black American poet Reginald Dwayne Betts. So Dwayne Betts is a fantastic poet who was imprisoned as a young man because of an incident that he was involved in prison, trained as a lawyer and as a poet. And so Betts and Zhadan don't know each other. They come from very different environments and worlds. And yet there are certain themes that motivate both of their writing and both of their poetry, right? So a sort of lyrical love for difficult places, for the difficult places they come from, a sort of reflection on the impact of violence and of forms of masculinity, right? All of these things can kind of bring their work together. So when they write to each other, it's as if they're old friends. Betts actually writes to Zhadan, you know, I was reading your poetry aloud to some of my friends and they thought I had written it. And I found that really moving, that it opens up the idea to think beyond natural allies, right? And to find allies in thematic, in sort of experiential ways as well. And this is another way, I think, to avoid this fatigue that we're talking about, right? Finding new people that we can talk to.
I would like remember about Taiwan again. Sorry that because I remember that, okay, we recognize Taiwan, we break our relationships normal with China. And so what to do? And so we started to invite some Chinese philosophers, you know, professors to Lithuania to visit, at least to meet them. You know, a few of them came to Vytautas Magnus here, you know, and I discussed with few of them philosophers, and for me it was absolutely wonderful because they were representatives of critical theory and critical pedagogy. Why it was so wonderful? Because critical theory and critical pedagogy is more or less anarchist ideas, you know. These critical anarchist ideas, I start to think, look, you actually, now I could understand why China could not accept you. This is absolutely impossible, you know, that such kind of you know, philosophers could be in China. Absolutely, this is unbelievable. This is, you know, breaks everything. But for me, it was very interesting as well, because I always imagined that Taiwan is very right-wing country, you know, right-wing country, which always, you know, try to represent old traditions, you know, before Maoist and blah, 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 you know. And there I met completely leftist anarchists between them. And all of them were professors, you know, and they published many of books. It's, wow, see, this is completely unexpected. I didn't wait from Taiwan, this one turn, how it's possible, you know. This is unexplainable until now for me.
So that's would be a question for both of us, starting from this point. And I think, you know, there is this kind of side discussion and resentment toward all the attention Ukraine has now from so-called global south. I'm not comfortable with the term, but somehow it's used everywhere. That okay, that's all very much centered of Europe. You're all white people, and that's moral relativism. And there are a lot of other problems in the world. Why all focus only on Ukraine, on Ukrainian refugees, and so forth. And now we have this actually example of solidarity toward non-European nation, toward actually Asian country, you know, oppressed countries, and how can we put this message out that we have this solidarity, we understand that there is some parallel between Russian colonialism, for example, and British, Belgian, French, whatever colonialism. So we are ready for this solidarity. So how can we pack this message effectively?
I think that this is a task, unfortunately, for Ukrainians themselves, right? Because I think one of the problems that's happening right now is because of the way that it's mediated through these former imperial centers, these still unworked through imperial centers in some way, the message comes across as highly hypocritical. And I completely understand that, right? So I understand why it's hard to sit and listen to a British government that is quite appalling in many ways, speak very proudly of its support for Ukraine. But Ukrainians have the language to talk about this, and so many of our Ukrainian colleagues are doing this wonderfully, about the solidarity that they feel with other post-imperial societies, about the ways in which this is a war of imperial aggression, a colonial war, right? These terms resonate. I think the other thing that has to always be emphasized is this is not about sort of, we want to bring Ukraine down to the suffering that other peoples of the world are feeling. Rather, it's about setting a new standard that needs to be extended globally, right? How refugees have been treated, how Ukrainian refugees have been treated in Europe needs to be the standard, right? We need to make that a more universal pattern.
For me, the biggest impression after 24th of February, I got very deep impression that so many million of refugees Poland accepted. You know, for me it's some kind. Was a revolution in my empathy. I think that, look, no one European country was not ready to accept so many refugees immediately without any conditions, you know. Unconditional friendship. This is very important. Unconditional friendship when you're supporting somebody, you know, without any strong expectation that you after it, you actually could try to find economical reasons or the others, you know. But at the beginning, this unconditional supporting. This unconditional is very important because I would say that many of the other countries have the only conditional supporting of Ukraine, you know. That's, I would say, that political opinions is always under changing. I would recommend for Ukraine to try to collaborate with United States until United States support Ukraine, you know, because you never know what could happen with them. But what you could trust in this situation, I would say that Poland and Baltic countries. This is because why? What is the difference? Because in the first case, it was some kind of geopolitical conditional supporting and unconditional supporting. This is very very different because I respect somebody on the street unconditionally. You know, this is very important because this unconditional respect means that some kind of some kind of respect of myself. You know, this is why important. I support Ukraine not because I am looking something from Ukraine, but because this is my identity. This was what is very important, and I am not sure about long-term European or world supporting, you know. And this is why I started to speak about regional communication and regional identity, which means that in some, it could happen. I am not looking for such a result, but it could happen that one moment we will need to fight the only together, you know. And this is why it's important this unconditional, being together.
As kind of final question, I would ask you for advice for the audience. In these days, challenging days, what authors, not only intellectuals, maybe also artists, would you from the 70s, from the 60s, from the previous era of this underground art dissidents, what would you recommend to reconsider, to read again, to watch again, think again? Who is relevant again?
That's it's for me. It's not very clear your intention of question, but I just thought when you asked, I thought, okay, who could represent some independent Lithuanian spirit, in other countries, in novel, I would say, in fiction style. And I there will recommend untranslated into other languages, representative of Lithuanian Lithuanian magical realism. Just one moment, just. Oh yeah.
Actually,
Okay.
the idea of the question was to look again at the persons, at the names we forgot, or we.
Okay, that's very easy. Which is translated and quite popular. The popular Ričardas Gavelis, Lithuanian writer, in his novel Vilnius Pokeris. I would say that it will be quite easy to start. And from Lithuanian philosophers who was very friendly for Ukraine, it's Leonidas Donskis. It's as well very easy. But there are actually more difficult for translation poets and writers. So because there was quite popular Lithuanian magical realism, but which is not translated into many of languages, but it's very, I would say, native, or if you would like, pagan, and it will, many of Polish readers could be very happy, because in their romantic, imaginary, all Lithuanians little bit savage and and magic. They eat magic mushrooms, and there are many, some of Lithuanian writers who could satisfy their expectations.
Well, my suggestion is not going to be any sort of a revelation for a Ukrainian audience, but I think it's important to return to Vasyl Stus. And I think here we're talking again about a dissident who died in the Gulag, right? So this is looping back to Marynovych here. And Stus's poetry and his writing is, I think, one of those that also retains these universal kind of perspectives that is still extremely important today, making sense of the historic relationship between Russia and Ukraine, right? But also the human rights, human dignity, all of that. So Stus is someone to come back to always.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here for us, and I also very grateful for Renaissance Foundation in Ukraine. They helped organize this discussion for us, and we'll be back with another discussion on Saturday. So please come back to the same Facebook pages to join us in our discussion. Thank you.